Hi everyone, good to see you again. As the lockdown is continuing and we are encouraged to have a whole Bible month on the book of Ruth found in the Old Testament, that was part of our plan to indeed put that on the preaching plan and encourage churches and the preachers that would be going to those churches to look at the book of Ruth. But as our lockdown continues and we're unsure of how long it's going to be, I thought I would bring you a Bible study of Ruth. So I'm going to work my way through Ruth in 4 chunks, so 4 different recordings, and hopefully together we can explore something of this beautiful Old Testament book. The translation that I use is the New Living Translation. There is no one better than the other. It's just if you find a translation that for you really works and helps you connect, then that's good. What I tend to do is look at all the translations available and then choose the one. But over the years, the one that I've come recently to and begun to really love is the New Living Translation. But whatever translation you use, that'll be really good, because there will be words that will be different from the ones in mine, and that stimulates our thoughts and helps us to see the meaning within the text. So let's have a think first about Ruth. The story of Ruth is set in the period of the Judges, and the Judges period ranged from 1375 to 1050 BC. So a long time ago. However, determining when the book was actually written is more difficult, and there are guesses that range from 950 to 700 BC. The days of the Judges, when the book is set, was a dark time in the history of the people of Israel. And I'm just going to read one verse of Judges. So Judges chapter 17 verse 6 just gives us an inkling of how difficult that period was. And of course I've cheated once again and I've marked all these references, so don't worry if you don't get there as quickly as I do. So Judges 17 verse 6 says, "In those days Israel had no king, so the people did whatever seemed right in their own eyes." That's a hugely revealing verse, isn't it? They did exactly what they thought was right in their own eyes. I don't think we need too much imagination to see what was going on. Israel itself had come through years of upheaval. At the Exodus, their God had, as they believed, rescued them from slavery in Egypt. After their wilderness years, he had preserved them through the wars of conquest and ushered them into possession of their promised land. But the people of God, now in Canaan, were struggling to adjust to a farming style of life and to becoming one among many nations. There were many temptations, especially the confusing array of other gods, often intertwined with agriculture. In the days when the Judges ruled, the people were caught in a tension between the will of Yahweh, the God of Israel, which they knew had relevance to every area of life, and the existing social order and its cycle of agricultural life patterns that they found themselves. So there was a tension going on. They were surrounded by the religion of Baal or Baal. Doesn't matter how you pronounce that, okay, so don't worry, it's just B-A-A-L. So you can say Baal, you can say Baal. But they were surrounded by this religion, and so began the creep to the extent that in times of military crisis they would look to Yahweh, their God, but for success in agriculture, they would look to Baal. Baal was the name of the supreme god worshipped in ancient Canaan. He was associated with fertility and rain, as in rain falling from the skies. So you can see, can't you, what's going on here? If you're in an area and everyone else is relying on this god, you eventually become part of that, not looking to your God, but looking to this God of fertility and rain if you're trying to be successful in agriculture. Before the Hebrews entered the promised land, the Lord God warned them. He warned them against worshipping Canaan's gods. And we can find that warning in Deuteronomy, so very near the beginning of the Bible. Deuteronomy and chapter 6 verses 14 and 15 says this: "You must not worship any of the gods of neighbouring nations, for the Lord your God who lives among you is a jealous God. His anger will flare up against you and wipe you from the face of the earth." Pretty categorical, that, isn't it? That warning. But despite that warning, Israel turned to idolatry anyway. It became a period of great evil for which they were punished. And we can read in Judges chapter 2 verses 11 to 17. So Judges 2 verses 11 to 17. "Then the Israelites did what was evil in the Lord's sight and worshipped the images of Baal. They abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt. They chased after other gods, worshipping the gods of the people around them, and they angered the Lord. They abandoned the Lord to serve Baal and the images of Ashtoreth. This made the Lord burn with anger against Israel, so he handed them over to marauders who stole their possessions. He sold them to their enemies all around, and they were no longer able to resist them. Every time Israel went out to battle, the Lord fought against them, bringing them defeat, just as he promised, and the people were very distressed. Then the Lord raised up judges to rescue the Israelites from their enemies. Yet Israel did not listen to the judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods, bowing down to them. How quickly they turned away from the path of their ancestors, who had walked in obedience to the Lord's commands." So we have a real window there, don't we, into what's going on, the period that this book is set in. So the people refused to listen, and they refused to change. The lure of other gods, the social chaos, the personal misery, and the harsh experience of divine judgment are all the things which characterised the days when the judges ruled. There was total national unrest and international strife, and the mood is dark. And yet, into this darkness shines the book of Ruth. It is into this time in God's people that we discover this gem of a book. So Ruth is the 8th book of the Old Testament, and it's only one of 2 in the entire Bible named after a woman, the other one being Esther. In many ways, the story of Ruth is about very ordinary people facing very ordinary events. And yet in other ways, it is a remarkable story of love, a remarkable story of loyalty, and it's an essential link in the chain of the genealogy of King David and Jesus Christ. And that is evidenced at the very end of the book of Ruth in chapter 4, verses 17 to 22. But let's not jump there quite yet. The author is anonymous, although some suggest it may indeed be Samuel, but we don't need to know who wrote the book to appreciate its beauty and its message. So there's a little bit of background before we even start. So we know where we are. We're in the period of the Judges, way before the birth of Christ. Some 1,000 years or more before the birth of Christ. So let's begin. Let's begin with the book of Ruth. We're going to begin with chapter 1, and we're going to read the first 5 verses. In the days when the judges ruled in Israel, a man from Bethlehem in Judah left the country because of a severe famine. He took his wife and 2 sons and went to live in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife was Naomi. Their 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in the land of Judah. During their stay in Moab, Elimelech died, and Naomi was left with her 2 sons. The 2 sons married Moabite women. One married a woman named Orpah, and the other a woman named Ruth. But about 10 years later, both Mahlon and Chilion died. This left Naomi alone without her husband or sons. Moab was the land east of what we now call the Dead Sea. It was one of the nations that oppressed Israel during the period of the Judges. So we're going back into the book of Judges. It's very easy to find Judges because it's right next to Ruth, so that really helps. And we're just going to go back into Judges chapter 3, verses 12 to 14. This is what it says. Once again, the Israelites did what was evil in the Lord's sight. So the Lord God gave King Eglon of Moab control over Israel. Together with the Ammonites and Amalekites, Eglon attacked Israel and took possession of Jericho, and the Israelites were subject to Eglon of Moab for 18 years. So this was one of the nations that had oppressed Israel. So there was hostility between the 2 nations, between Moab and Israel. From this information, we are able to grasp how severe the famine must have been in Israel for Elimelech to move his family to Moab. Even if Israel had already defeated Moab, there still would have been tensions between the 2 nations. Elimelech and his family are called Ephrathites simply because an earlier name for Bethlehem was Ephrath. So don't be confused, they are definitely from Bethlehem. Bethlehem itself was a large town 5 miles south of present-day Jerusalem. Its name means house of bread, pointing to the unusual fertility of that area for grain harvesting. And it underlines the shock of the famine, doesn't it? We are shocked because of all the places Bethlehem, the house of bread, should have escaped the famine, but it has not. Apparently there was no such famine, though, some 50 miles to the southeast in Moab across the Dead Sea. So it would have been a huge decision for Elimelech to move his family into a foreign land, and it must have been determined by a desire to escape death through starvation. This is serious time for Elimelech and his family. He has to make this momentous decision to save their lives. Now there's irony, isn't there, in this story? The irony is that all 3 men of the family died in Moab, leaving Naomi the widow far more bereft and isolated than if they had remained in the fellowship of their homeland. Sometimes the decisions that we make have dire consequences. After having been introduced, us, the readers, introduced to their positions in the family, husband, wife, sons, the characters themselves are then introduced by their names. Elimelech, meaning my God is king. Significant, of course, in this evil time where there is no king and they are under the rule of judges. Elimelech is faithful to God. He's faithful to the God of Israel, and his name tells us that. My God is king. We have his wife, Naomi, meaning pleasant, lovely, delightful, a woman whose lot in life sadly turns very bitter. We have Malon, a son, meaning weakness or sickness, and we have Chilion, meaning annihilation or consumption. They're strange names, aren't they, for sons? I wouldn't have given my sons those names, would you? But of course this is significant in this story. These are the sons who die young and leave no offspring. It is interesting to note that although Elimelech is named first, Naomi quickly becomes the focus of attention in the story, and the other characters are named in reference to her. So we get Naomi's husband, her 2 sons, and her daughters-in-law. Since there was no ban on marriages between Israelites and foreigners in the early biblical period, it is quite natural that Naomi's sons should marry local Moabite girls. However, Moabites were not allowed to worship at the tabernacle because they had not let the Israelites pass through their land during the Exodus from Egypt. The irony is, of course, that as God's chosen nation, Israel should have set the standards of high moral living for all the other nations. However, as we will discover through this study, it was Ruth, a Moabite woman, whom God used as an example of genuine spiritual character. The name Ruth means friend or companion, whereas Orpah means back of the neck, as seen when one turns away. We need to note that the character of Orpah, who is not bad but represents the norm or the expected, serves in this story as a contrast to Ruth, who goes far beyond the norm in maintaining her loyalty. So the meaning of their names sets the scene for the story. The beginning of the story is bound up in tragedy and grief. Naomi has lost her husband and both her sons, and there is no heir by which their names will be continued and their inheritance guaranteed. Her men had died, and so had their names. As we read, we experience a real sense of shock that one person should be called on to suffer so much, and all of it away from her homeland and the people who knew her and could comfort her. Naomi has lost everything. her husband, her sons, her means of survival, and she is in a foreign place. Surely it was undeserved, surely unexpected. But this is real life. And in real life there are our pains, and sometimes those pains seem unbearable. Some of our circumstances seem so unjust, and some of our questions remain without answers. This is a painful story about Naomi and her loss. We can perhaps relate to this right now as we are in the coronavirus lockdown. All of those selfless doctors, nurses, carers, all of those who are on the front line of this virus battle, many of them losing their lives as they try to save the lives of others. Life is often unfair, and life is often cruel, and the beginning of this story of Ruth is one of those. So let's carry on and see what happens next. We read chapter 1, verses 6 to 15. Then Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had blessed his people in Judah by giving them good crops again. So Naomi and her daughters-in-law get ready to leave Moab to return to her homeland. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she set out from the place where she had been living, and they took the road that would lead them back to Judah. But on the way, Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back to your mothers. Go back to your mothers' homes instead of coming with me, and may the Lord reward you for your kindness to your husbands and to me. May the Lord bless you with security of another marriage." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they all broke down and wept. "No," they said, "we want to go with you to your people." But Naomi replied, "Why should you go on with me? Can I still give birth to other sons who could grow up to be your husbands? No, my daughters, return to your parents' homes, for I am too old to marry again. And even if it were possible, and I were to get married tonight and bear sons, then what? Would you wait for them to grow up and refuse to marry someone else? No, of course not, my daughters. Things are far more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord himself has caused me to suffer." And again they wept together. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye. But Ruth insisted on staying with Naomi. "See," Naomi said to her, "your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. You should do the same." So we can tell, can't we, that somehow Naomi has been able to keep in touch with how things are going in her homeland. For she hears that the famine is over, and she makes the decision to return home. This is really her only option and her only hope. There was almost nothing worse than being a widow in the ancient world. Widows were taken advantage of, or they were ignored. and they were almost always poverty-stricken. God's law therefore provided that the nearest male relative of the dead husband should care for the widow. But Naomi had no male relatives in Moab. If she stayed, she would have certainly perished. Furthermore, she cannot provide for her widowed daughters-in-laws, so she begs them to return to their own mothers' homes, where they may find security in the form of remarriage. It was a very different culture to our own, of course. Women relied entirely upon the men for their survival. Initially, both Ruth and Orpah refused to leave Naomi. That gives us a true picture of how close the three women are. And Naomi's plea to them in verses 12 and 13, where she addresses both these women as her daughters, is very moving, and it refers to the levirate marriage described in Deuteronomy chapter 25. So if you want to read about the rules of this marriage provision, you can look at this in your own time. Deuteronomy chapter 25. And in it you'll find it is the obligation of a dead man's brother to care for the widow. But Naomi had no other sons for Ruth or Orpah to marry, and she's too old now, even if it was possible in the future, to provide these sons for them to marry. This is exaggerated rhetoric on Naomi's part because she's desperate to convince both women how hopeless it is for them. For she, Naomi, cannot provide for them. We can tell when we read the story that both her daughters-in-law love Naomi. But eventually, Orpah is persuaded to leave. Remember, of course, what her name meant, Orpah, back of the neck, i.e. in turning away. So eventually Orpah is persuaded to leave, and she goes back. And Naomi urges Ruth to do the same. But Ruth is a different character altogether, and she's not successful in persuading her. So let's continue. We read verses 16 to 18. But Ruth replied, "Don't ask me to leave you and turn back. I will go wherever you go and live wherever you live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. I will die where you die, and will be buried there. May the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us." So when Naomi saw that Ruth had made up her mind to go with her, she stopped urging her. The startling thing here for us to note is that even though Ruth is a Moabite, she has at some point become a faithful believer in Yahweh, the God of Israel. Her moving speech pledges her loyalty to Naomi in life and in death. This is, in effect, a change of identity. She is changed from being a Moabite to becoming an Israelite, where Ruth adopts the people and the God of Naomi. Religion was bound up with ethnicity in biblical times. Each people had its own lands and its own gods. So to change religion meant to change nationality. This commitment of Ruth's is key to what happens in the future. For even though Ruth belonged to a race often despised by Israel, we discover that she is mightily blessed because of her faithfulness. But perhaps we need to ask the question, where did she get that faith from? And why was she so convinced? Why did she literally change her identity from Moabite to Israelite? This had to be because of Naomi's faith, surely. When we think of how filled with tragedy Naomi's life was, perhaps we should also reflect that through it all she must have remained a faithful believer of and witness to God. We see that in the person of Ruth. So let's finish the chapter, verses 19 to 22. So the two of them continued on their journey. When they came to Bethlehem, the entire town was stirred by their arrival. "Is it really Naomi?" the women asked. "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Instead, call me Mara, for the Almighty has made life very bitter for me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me home empty. Why should you call me Naomi, when the Lord has caused me to suffer and the Almighty has sent such tragedy?" So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by her daughter-in-law Ruth, the young Moabite woman. They arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Naomi's return to Bethlehem after her long absence creates quite a stir. She had left Israel married and secure with 2 sons. She returns widowed, childless, and poor, with a Moabite daughter-in-law. The tongue soon begins to waggle. She cannot bear to be called Naomi, preferring Mara, which means bitter. For her life is now bitter and it is empty. Notice in verse 21, as previously in verse 13, that she believes that the bitter experiences she has coped with were from the hand of God. In contrast, the place that she left in famine is now enjoying the barley harvest. In many ways, this first chapter of Ruth covers a lot of ground. It certainly spans several years, more than 10, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. This little bit, this little chapter has covered more than 10 years in the life of Naomi. And it is a sorry tale. But it is, of course, only the beginning of an incredible love story that indeed connects to Christ himself. And next time we will continue by looking at chapter